I want to begin by making clear what this video is not. I'm not especially interested in bashing Jason Arday, and I'm not interested in jumping on another culture war bandwagon. He's already been subjected to an enormous amount of public criticism, and there's very little I could add in the way of personal condemnation that's not already been said, often much more harshly than I would say. So if you're looking for a video whose main purpose is to ridicule or destroy somebody who's already experienced a very public fall from grace, this is not that video. Although I do appreciate the opportunity now and again for making fun of people and situations, so I might make the odd quip here and there. But nor am I here to defend him. From what has been publicly reported so far, at least some of the allegations appear serious and appear to require proper investigation. Nonetheless, allegations of plagiarism and other disputed claims should be dealt with through the evidence and appropriate academic or institutional processes. My own view, subject to whatever further evidence establishes, is that there appear to be genuine matters that Jason Arday needs to address. But accountability and public humiliation are not the same thing, and the latter is not the purpose of this discussion. But having said that, and just quietly, I'm not impressed by the situation either. I mean, it took me 10 years after completing my PhD and the writing of at least 30 academic papers before I landed a full-time academic position. And it certainly wasn't at Cambridge. And that was a lot of heartbreak for me. I also want to avoid amateur psychology. People on the internet have used words such as narcissist, fabulist, compulsive liar, con man, and various other psychological or moral labels. Now, I am not a psychologist. I do not know Jason Arday personally, and I have no basis for diagnosing him. Even where professional psychologists comment from afar, there are obvious limits to what can be known about a human being through news reports, social media clips, and disputed public claims. So I'm going to leave the diagnosis alone. And yes, I will definitely avoid terms like narcissist and pseudologica fantastica, no matter how appropriate they may appear to be. What interests me is something I've written about elsewhere, including in my own work on presence and the deep self. I call it the ego fall. And rather than just asking, what is wrong with Jason Arday? I want to ask a different question. What can a case like this teach the rest of us about the stories we construct around ourselves? Why those stories sometimes collapse, and what we can do when they do. So, what is an ego fall? An ego fall occurs when a story we've built about ourselves collides with reality, and our reality can no longer be sustained. The story may involve our status, goodness, competence, intelligence, spirituality, moral virtue, attractiveness, importance, specialness, victimhood. We become attached to a particular picture of who we are and how other people should see us. Then life supplies information that does not fit the picture. Now, sometimes the fall is small. Your boss tells you that the work you thought was brilliant is mediocre. Your spouse points out that the generous person you imagine yourself to be has been behaving selfishly. A friend notices that your supposed easygoing nature disappears the moment somebody threatens your status. You may discover that a relationship was not what you thought it was, and that you are not indispensable at work, or that a talent you regarded as exceptional is actually rather ordinary. These are all forms of reality correcting the story. At other times, the ego structure has been built much higher. The story may have been repeated for years and embedded in a career, public reputation, institutional identity, or community. Then the fall can be spectacular, as with Jason Arday. The larger the distance between the constructed identity and the underlying reality, and the more people who have been recruited into believing the story, the greater the potential crash. So let's look at this Jason Arday case study. Now, the Jason Arday case is interesting in terms of the ego fall. His public story was extraordinary. A black scholar who had faced profound disability and disadvantage, who overcame enormous obstacles and ultimately reached one of the most prestigious universities in the world. Whatever the precise facts eventually proved to be, that narrative was clearly central to his public profile. It came to embody not merely academic success, but a remarkable story of overcoming exclusion and adversity. That kind of narrative has immense symbolic power. It can become larger than the person. It can be repeated in media profiles, institutional publicity, public talk, social media, and the stories told by supporters. And once a story becomes socially distributed in this way, any substantial challenge to its factual basis produces more than an individual embarrassment. It threatens a whole network of beliefs and investments around the person. This is where I would introduce another idea, the ego control structure. By this I mean a system through which we attempt to manage how other people perceive us and sometimes how they behave towards us. It can include impression management, selective storytelling, exaggeration, concealment, rationalization, manipulation, or control of the narrative. None of these behaviors automatically proves a psychiatric condition. They are things ordinary people do to varying degrees, including me, such as when I pretend to be this holy moly guy on the internet. But when the fabrications become systematic, they can create a self-image that requires increasing amounts of energy and disinformation to maintain. If, hypothetically, parts of a public persona were built on misrepresentation, the problem becomes self-reinforcing. One falsehood may require another. One exaggeration has to be protected by another explanation. Challenges must be neutralized. Contradictory information becomes threatening. The person may increasingly be forced to defend the story rather than live in reality. At some point, the structure may become so elaborate and so brittle that the crash is almost inevitable. That observation should remain conditional. In Arday's case, I don't know how much deception or manipulation occurred, what was deliberate, what may have been misunderstanding, or what ultimately will be substantiated. Internet discourse should always be taken with a very large grain of salt, especially when an algorithmically amplified community becomes convinced there's only one possible interpretation, no matter how likely. Apparent consensus can be informative, but it can also become a machine for narrowing perception. Lots of online influencers fall into this trap, and I shouldn't name anybody. At any rate, the fall will come eventually for these people. And we're talking about taking a long walk off El Capitan without a rope. So, ego falls are not only individual things. There's another dimension here. They can happen to groups and institutions as well as individuals. A community can become invested in a person who symbolizes its values. Colleagues and supporters can lend their credibility to that person, and this appears to be what happened in the Cambridge case. When the central narrative is challenged, those surrounding structures can experience their own version of the fall. Now, this does not mean that everyone who supported a person shares responsibility for that person's alleged wrongdoing. It means that human beings frequently participate in collective narratives. We enjoy stories that confirm who we think we are. Institutions do this too. Groups do it, including online echo chambers. When reality exposes a major blind spot, the institution or group has a choice. Defend the story, blame an individual and pretend the surrounding system had nothing to do with it, or take its own ego fall and ask what it failed to see. So, does it have any relevance to those of us who are never going to become celebrated Cambridge professors? Alas. So the answer is yes. In fact, most ego falls are much smaller and much more ordinary than the spectacular public examples that make the news. Most of us do not have millions of observers. Our ego stories may exist in the minds of a spouse, a few friends, a boss, work colleagues, students, clients, or family members. Sometimes no other person is involved at all. We've simply maintained a story privately, and circumstances eventually show us that it is partly or completely untrue. These private ego falls are often gentler because we don't have to endure mass public humiliation. We may merely have to sit down and have a painfully honest conversation with ourselves. Fame changes the scale. If you're a celebrity, politician, academic star, influencer, or other public figure, your identity exists in far more minds. Media coverage, awards, institutional prestige, and social media can continuously reinforce the story. The magnitude of the potential fall, therefore, depends partly on how high the identity has been built, how deeply we've invested ourselves in it, and how many other minds have been recruited into believing it. Fame does not necessarily create the ego structure, but it can amplify both the inflation and the collapse. So, this is what I suggest. Take the fall before somebody else trips you up. One of the central ideas in my work is that it's far better to identify an ego structure yourself than to wait for somebody else to expose it. It's better to take the fall voluntarily than to wait until life trips you and you land face down in front of everybody. If I notice that I have exaggerated my importance, manipulated somebody's perception of me, become attached to being the cleverest person in the room, unlikely as that may be, or built some unflattering story about my spirituality, generosity, or insight, I have an opportunity. I can allow a small collapse right now. I can admit that the story is inflated. It may sting, I may feel embarrassed, but the damage is usually far smaller than if I defend the structure for another year or 10 and force reality to demolish it for me. This principle is especially important with what I call the spiritual ego. The spiritual ego can build a sophisticated identity around being awakened, wise, intuitive, compassionate, morally advanced, woke, or somehow more conscious than ordinary people. The problem is not confidence, spirituality, or genuine insight. The problem arises when the identity requires superiority and when contradiction becomes threatening. A person may become deeply invested in being seen as evolved while becoming less and less willing to see the shadow within themselves. You might call this the spiritual wanker, but I won't go into any details. The same structure can appear in intellectual, political, moral, and professional life. We can become attached to being the enlightened one, the oppressed one, the heroic survivor, the visionary, the genius, the victim, the indispensable leader, the morally pure activist, if you're those around, or the person who always sees through everybody else's illusions. Any identity can become an ego structure if we need the story to protect our worth. And let's face it, part of Jason Arday's situation is because he fit the exalted story that Cambridge, academia, and much of our institutions want us to believe. A black, autistic, developmentally delayed individual with a brain tumor and who can run ultra marathons. Faster than a speeding bullet, able to leap tall buildings in a single bound. All of those things may possibly not be true. It's a nice story. It's a great story, but it appears to have completely crumbled. In my next video, I'll explain just what can we all do when we encounter an ego fall. I'm Marcus D'Anthony. See you then.